Hello students. So today we are going to start with the topic of active transport. What is active transport? It is the movement of dissolved molecules into or out of a cell through a cell membrane from a region of lower concentration to a region of higher concentration. So it is basically the movement of molecules, dissolved molecules, through a membrane, that is semi-permeable membrane or a completely permeable membrane, from a region of high concentration to a region of from a region of low concentration to a region of higher concentration. The particles moves against the constant concentration gradient. That means the difference in the concentration using energy released during respiration. Sometimes dissolved molecules are at a higher concentration inside the cell than outside, but because the organism needs these molecules, they still have to be absorbed. So what are carrier proteins? Carrier proteins are those which pick up specific molecules and take them through the cell membrane against the concentration gradient. Types of active transport. There are two types of active transport, basically primary active transport and secondary active transport. In the process of transportation, the energy is utilized by the breakdown of ATP, that is adenosine triphosphate, to transport molecules across the membrane against a concentration gradient. So in primary active transport, what happens is the energy is utilized by the breakdown of ATP, that is adenosine triphosphate, to transport membranes across the membrane, to transport molecules across the membrane against the concentration gradient, that is the difference in the concentration. Therefore, all the groups of ATP power pumps contain one or more binding sites for the ATP molecules, which are present on the systolic face of the membrane, that is downward side. Basically, the primary active transport usually uses external chemical energy such as the ATP. Sodium potassium pump, the most important pump in the animal cell, is considered as an example of primary active transport. In this process of transportation, the sodium ions are moved to the outside of the cell and potassium ions are moved in the inside of the cell. So in this type of transport, what happens is sodium ions are moved outside of the cell and potassium ions are moved inside the cell. Secondary active transport. In secondary active transport is a kind of active transport that uses electrochemical energy. And the first active, it uses the energy produced by the breakdown of ATP, that is adenosine triphosphate. In this, it uses the electrochemical energy. It takes place across a biological membrane where a transporter protein couples the movement of an electrochemical ion, typically a sodium or a hydrogen, down its electrochemical gradient to the upward movement of another molecule or an ion against a concentration or electrochemical gradient. So what happens is it basically takes place across a biological membrane where the transporter protein couples with basically an electrochemical ion and typically a sodium or a hydrogen, and then it couples and helps in the upward movement of another molecules against the concentration gradient. Examples of active transport include phagocytosis of bacteria by macrophages, a movement of calcium ions out of cardiac muscle cells, transportation of amino acids across the intestinal lining of the human gut, secretion of proteins like enzymes, peptide hormones, and antibodies from different cells, functioning of the white blood cells by protecting our body by attacking diseases causing microbes and other foreign invaders, uptake of glucose by epithelial cells in the belly of the small intestine. So phagocytosis is done by of the bacteria by macrophages, and movement of calcium out of the cardiac muscle cells, and then the transportation of amino acids across the intestinal lining, secretion of proteins and antibodies from different cells, functioning of the RBC, white WBC, and uptake of glucose by epithelial cells. So here is the difference between active transport versus diffusion and osmosis. So let's discuss about active transport in plants. Like humans and animals, plants also require transport systems which are mainly involved in the transport of materials such as water, minerals, and necessary nutrients to all parts of the plants for its survival. So like humans, plants also need to transport minerals minerals to various parts of the plant for its survival. Active transport is a mode of transportation in plants which uses stored energy to move the particles against the concentration gradient. So in plants, the active mode of transport, what it does is it uses the energy uses the energy that is already stored to move the particles across the concentration gradient. In a plant cell, it takes place in the root cells by absorbing water and minerals. It takes place in the root, and active transport also leads to accumulation of molecules and ions towards one side of the membrane. So basically in this, what happens due to the movement of the concentration gradient, due to the movement of the molecules, because of the concentration gradient, the molecules and ions move to a particular side of the membrane. And this mode of transportation in plants is carried out by the membrane proteins and transports the substance from the lower concentration to a higher concentration, same as that. Now in the next class we'll start with passive transport.